I'm going to be talking about a topic that I explored many years ago. Then I decided to stop. Then I went back to it. And then the corresponding paper has been modified by so many reviewers that now doesn't look anything like the ideas that I had. So this talk is more or less the exploring of those ideas in order to see what fits and what is still interesting and what is absolutely wrong. I am not an optimist philosopher, but this is maybe the only optimist take that I had in any philosophical issue. And so I would be very appreciative of any of your comments, concerns, etc. And thank you, everybody. So you may see 50 slides. Don't worry. I hope I can finish on time or even earlier. So just a second. The question that I will tackle here is, can any philosophically biased historical reconstruction be epistemically valuable? And so the goal for this talk is to argue that there are some philosophically biased historical reconstructions that might play a crucial role, epistemically speaking, in enhancing philosophical understanding about science and about our philosophical theses about science. So the main thesis that I will defend can be summarized in these three following points. Certain biased historical reconstructions contribute to a deeper understanding of philosophical theses about science by clarifying key concepts, illustrating their applications, or shedding light on the historical episodes that they engage with. This might not look any problematic at all to you, and that's okay. That's actually one of the intuitions that we have when we are using case studies in philosophy of science to illustrate concepts, to clarify certain notions that we have, and so on and so forth. But I will also want to defend that they achieve this by effectively exemplifying salient features of philosophical theses, as well as by providing context and identifying potential challenges for their evaluation. So this paper has been rejected many times from different journals because people tend to look at the first part and say, oh, this is very obvious. And then they don't look at what this is doing. So what I am trying to do is to explain why we have these practices and why they are not so sketchy or they are not so fishy as one should intuitively believe they are. And finally, I will say that the type of understanding that this reconstruction fosters is non-factive, and more significantly aligns with the structuralist takes on scientific understanding. So I'm going to go through some preliminaries, then I'm going to talk about the negative side of having philosophically biased historical reconstructions in the philosophy of science, and then I'm going to try to defend some of those. I'm going to say how they relate to understanding, and I'm going to draw some final remarks. That said, philosophical theses about science. So they are general explanatory claims about underlying mechanisms of scientific activity. We philosophers of science know many theses. Some of them are very general, some of them are more concrete, some of them are explanatory of very specific phenomena, and some are expected to be very explanatory of almost everything that looks alike like science. Now, philosophical theses about science can be characterized as structured theoretical frameworks composed by three main things. Not only, but at least by these three. General concepts, core notions or categories the thesis deploys to describe scientific practice, for instance, explanation, idealization, modeling practice, etc. Then inferential relations, inferences and relational structure. So the logical, modal, and conceptual relations that hold between those concepts. We claim something philosophically speaking, and we expect that the concepts that are there relate in a very particular manner. So that's how we have opponents. They might hold the same concepts, but they relate them differently, and so on and so forth. And we also need some sort of delimited logical space. This is the thesis outlines a space of possibilities or of possible scientific situations in which the concept and relations can be instantiated. This logical space encompasses admissible patterns of reasoning, expected behavior, surveillance, or theories, among other things. Now, historical reconstructions. don't pay much attention, just take the most general characterization that you can have. A historiographical narrative that puts together certain historical data about a given event, following a specific methodological constraints to distinguish between idle and relevant information when telling the history of such episode. So in philosophy of science, historical reconstructions are often used as evidence in favor of particular theses. However, to objectively provide such evidence, historical data is expected to be obtained independently from the preferred philosophical view. Otherwise, the resulting reconstructions will be philosophically biased and thus methodologically very flawed. So, what does it mean to be philosophically biased for a historical reconstruction? So the end up would be narratives in which some parts of the actual story has been ignored or dismissed in favor of the philosophical view that has been previously chosen, and that ideally this reconstruction will prove to be correct. So a reconstruction being philosophically biased is independent of such reconstruction being misleading or defective. It can be accurate, but still be philosophically biased because of the way in which you created it. So the reconstruction that is significantly philosophically theory-laden, that is the main idea. Whether a reconstruction is philosophically biased is independent from the agent's intent to mislead, to lie, to confuse, or simply they are very not capable of producing an accurate account of a particular phenomenon. So the agent's intentions are not going to be important here. Also, not all historically inaccurate reconstructions are going to be philosophically biased. We might not have enough information and still provide a historical reconstruction. We might be very bad at putting things together and produce a very bad or inaccurate historical reconstruction, and still it doesn't have anything to do with our philosophical stand. So now these things actually happen in philosophy of science. Let me introduce you to an example. Some philosophers have contended that science is often inconsistency tolerant. And these people have supplemented this claim with historical cases, Bohr's atom model of the atom, Newtonian mechanics, but also, being the most important of all these cases, the Newtonian early calculus. These people that are defending that science is often inconsistency tolerant come from a tradition informed by people like Lakatos, like Feyerabend, like Shapiro, but then more entrenched in the philosophy of logic literatures, like Graham Priest, Richard Rowley, Newton da Costa, Stephen French, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that the theory, the early calculus by Newton, was explicitly known to be inconsistent. How do we know this? Berkeley wrote a mention to Newton's theory, saying that it was inconsistent, and we know that Newton knows that. And so the fact that it was so clear to everybody that there was a discussion about whether infinitesimals were inconsistent entities or not has given us the impression that a contradiction was known to be occurring there. And still, for this branch of philosophers and logicians, this case illustrates that there was no problem. So against everything that traditional logic should be telling us, that there is the risk of logical explosion, irrationality of the scientist, and so on and so forth, this case actually shows a scientist, Newton, that has been using for a while an inconsistent theory, knowing it to be so, and still not having any problem at reasoning correctly. On the other hand, there are a bunch of philosophers, Peter Vickers, Kevin Davey, for instance, saying that the problem is that the reconstruction that these other philosophers are providing is very much incomplete. So the idea is they took pieces away that might prove that Newton was not committed to inconsistent entities, and they just decided to neglect that. And of course, in the end, something that looks like inconsistency toleration was provided as an example, but that's not the actual history of Newtonian early calculus. So actually, Peter Vickers claims in his book something very drastic about this. So that the simple story we are met with so often in the literature, meaning this paraconsistent literature, on the early calculus as a set of inconsistent propositions plus a logic is plain wrong. Brown and Priest are typical of a subsection of the philosophy of science that assumes that the early calculus can be reconstructed by making use of paraconsistent logic. To motivate, and this is very important, to motivate the application of a particular paraconsistent logic, they adopt chunk and permeate. So what Vickers is suggesting is some of these philosophers have actually chosen their philosophical theory or the logic, the proposed logic, call it chunk and permeate, and then they have put some pieces of the actual history and put it in such a way that they tell us a story that supports chunk and permeate. So is this the correct account? What we can see is that around the case study of Newtonian early calculus and whether it was inconsistent or not, there are many reconstructions. Some of them accommodate more historical evidence, some of them accommodate less, some of them, like chunk and permeate, sometimes is motivated by how we act as actual human reasoners, reason by chunking and compartmentalizing our beliefs. And then I wrote, this is part of the evidence that we have about how many reconstructions of the case are. So I wrote a paper, a draft of this paper, uploaded it in academia, and immediately next morning I received this email from a person saying that I wrote a text on inaccurate reconstruction. So that shouldn't be something that somebody jumps in and says, I write inaccurate reconstructions. But then this person says, you should look at mine. So when we look as logicians at the literature in this particular case, we are going to find many instances of interpreting how this case actually supports different logical systems, different logical strategies, different types of logic, classical logic, paraconsistent logic, fuzzy logic, among others. So we might see these examples, but we have to stop and ask, are they really bad? Let's say that Vickers is right and that these people actually made some very weird moves, historically speaking. Is this bad? And that should take us to the dilemma of case studies. The dilemma of case studies concludes that even very good case studies do not provide or do any philosophical work because at best they are heuristics, at worst they give false impressions that the history is on our side, sort of the history and philosophy of science version of manifest destiny. And so it is not clear what philosophical work is being done when using case studies for philosophical purposes. So a lesson from the dilemma of case studies is that even well-executed case studies might fail to carry real philosophical weight. At best, they served as suggestive tools. At worst, they misleadingly imply that history straightforwardly confirms or rejects philosophical claims. So we have two horns of the dilemma of case studies. On the one hand, if philosophers have a case that is clearly not philosophically biased, then it is also not philosophically relevant because it's only one case. It would be only a bunch of historical data, which it would be unclear what philosophical lessons can be learned. On the other hand, if philosophers have a case that is philosophically relevant, it is likely that it is also philosophically biased, because it might have been selected or tampered within the philosophical, to fit the philosophical point. So if the dilemma is correct, the philosophy of science might have failed to grasp any actual aspect of the scientific enterprise, and that should be scandalous, because the idea of doing philosophy of science is to explain scientific activity, and if we cannot grasp whatever we are talking about, so what is the difference between philosophy of science and science fiction, right? So the dilemma of case studies challenge has largely been understood as required either explanation of how this type of philosophical bias reconstructions can be avoided, or guidance on how to minimize the damage in philosophy of science. And there are three alternatives to respond to this challenge. So there is skepticism. People like Pitt would say the combination of philosophy and history of science is mostly historically and philosophically uninformative. We should stop doing this. We should stop looking at history from philosophical lenses. and thinking that it's going to provide us with the evidence that we are needing. That's not going to happen. We also have the Flationists like Burian or Kinsell, who would say that the relation between history and philosophy can still be beneficial for the philosophical party about the philosophical use of historical evidence. This is, don't aspire too much to have actual evidence or to refute or to confirm any philosophical thesis. That's not going to be possible while using only historical evidence. But then we have people like Kirsten and Andrew Curry, who are going to say something more optimist. Looking at the practices from a historiography of science, we can say that it is in general methodologically theory-laden, and this is not problematic in itself. As a matter of fact, the use of such theory-ladenness is what makes possible to provide historical explanations of specific and fine-grained aspects of the scientific practice. What has to be exercised is a higher standard of the methodological checking. So there are some suggestions on how to do this better. And again, this is very weird for me, but I would say, yes, let's take the optimist take on this. And are we safe? Such a happy ending. But what happens if we have philosophically biased historical reconstructions? Because the problem is the optimist take only explains us more or less why do they happen, but it doesn't really tell us why they are not dangerous. So it explains why they are so common or they can occur normally, but it doesn't explain us why we are epistemically safe even though they occur. So if philosophers of science have used philosophically biased reconstructions to guide and support their thesis, their philosophical work would be flawed to its grounds. So the evidence, the so-called evidence, actually doesn't exist. And we are talking about something that depends on the philosophical view that we are defending, and this looks very bad for philosophers. So let's go back to the dilemma of case studies. I take the most dangerous challenge of the dilemma of case studies can be subdivided into problems. The issue of evidence, meaning what happens when we have philosophically biased historical reconstructions that are not obtained independently from the view they were designed to support. Can they still provide any type of evidence? And also, we have the other issue, the issue of the epistemic goods. So let's take philosophically biased historical reconstructions and ask the question, do they do any epistemic work? Or are they really dangerous? Because it cannot be that they are idle and it's okay to have them as like figures that are over there, like decoring the house, but actually do nothing here. So if one can dismiss or at least significantly weaken these two issues, but one would be able to explain why philosophers of science have been rational even when working with philosophically biased historical reconstructions that are known to be so. And I'm going to take the issue of the epistemic goods. The issue of evidence has been worked by other philosophers. One of those is Duvian. But let's focus on the issue of epistemic goods. So let's ask ourselves the question, how are these things made? It's not just cherry picking. What does it mean to be cherry picking? So the idea is that you have a philosophical thesis that you propose or that you have been thinking about for a long time, and now you are going to try to find a reconstruction that illustrates that thesis, right? So let's start with a philosophical thesis, a broad claim about science, with the three characteristics that we said at the beginning. Now we identify a historical episodes. I really have been always been looking forward to illustrate my thesis with this particular type of scientific episode. And then you start selecting evidence guided by the theory or the thesis that you're trying to illustrate, right? So you emphasize the data that fits, and you dismiss, ignore, neglect the data that challenges the thesis. Then you build the reconstruction, arrange the episodes that exemplify the thesis neatly, probably trying to emphasize the relations that are held within the thesis or the philosophical view that you are defending. And the outcome is a very beautiful philosophically biased historical reconstructions, like the Newton story. Now, do we have something similar in other epistemic practices? And of course, after the Dubian talk, it's more or less obvious where we are going to find this similar practice. In model building in science, particularly when thinking about exemplification. So when you're trying to build a model in scientific context, what you're going to do is you define an epistemic target, you identify a phenomenon, a system, a process that you want to understand, then you construct a model by simplifying reality while preserving the salient features. This means that you know which ones are the salient features that you want to preserve. You select and highlight exemplified properties. The model instantiates and refers to relevant patterns or relations, but also hides or neglects or distorts features that are intentionally sidelined. Then you have to test coherence and applicability. So you look at how this model connects with the empirical domain and with the constraints that you know that exist in that domain and explanatory aims. At the end, what you have cooked and baked is a reliable exemplar that enables understanding of the target phenomenon by revealing structural, causal, or functional relations within the target system. So this is the epistemic success of exemplification. And when we look at the literature, maybe the most salient figure for this issue is Catherine Elding, who is going to say that exemplification consists in showing that a single item can, in the right context, exemplify any and many of its features, enable the interpreter to forge a variety of epistemically valuable connections across a variety of domains. What is key here is that if we recognize that the representation serves to illuminate the phenomena by exemplifying features it shares with them, and that it makes no commitment to the realism or of unexemplified features, we can see how such exemplars embody, advance, and convey understanding of the world. What Alvin is saying is basically that through exemplars, we tend to understand better, or we tend to start understanding a phenomenon. This happens in science. When you are teaching science to children, often teachers refer to exemplars so children can experiment with them or can imagine them in a simpler way, and so on and so forth. And it seems that it actually furthers understanding of scientific phenomena. So we know now that exemplification tends to lead to understanding, good exemplification. So we also know that building scientific models through exemplification is very similar to the way in which we build philosophically biased reconstructions when we are taking this task seriously. And so the question is, are they really similar processes? And if they are, is the outcome also similar? So if philosophically biased reconstructions exemplify something, what they are exemplifying? And the idea is very simple, and we also have seen people in the literature of integrated history and philosophy of science talking about this. For instance, take this quote from Hassog, who is saying that when we are talking about the use of episodes in philosophy of science, the episode is a concrete instantiation of the general concept, the characters, the settings, the type of events expected, and each episode also contributes to the articulation to the general concept. And the idea is that historical episodes are going to be connected to abstract philosophical conceptions through this set of mind. So philosophical theses about science. Remember, they are general concepts, as Hassog was mentioning, but they are also inferential and relational structure and delimited logical space. Let's go back to our example and think about this. So we have a philosophical thesis. Science is often inconsistency tolerant, and we have the idea of going for the Newtonian early calculus example. This cannot be actually the philosophical thesis that we have in mind. So let's press ourselves a little bit more and say, no. What I want to say is that there are some inconsistent bodies of scientific beliefs, statements, data, whatever we want to say there, that are actually useful in scientific enterprise and that therefore are not logically trivial. So me as a logician want to defend that inconsistency tolerant practices are epistemically rational, are logically safe, are inferentially also safe, meaning that it's not only the structure of the theory or the model that is safe, but also that the agents know how to navigate it safely. That's the difference between the two. So that said, I go to the case study and I say, well, let's take the infinitesimal calculus of Leibniz and Newton that is well known to have operated on an inconsistent basis, and now start listening to me as if I was Graham Priest saying this. In particular, at different points in the calculation of a derivative, infinitesimals had to be assumed to be both zero and non-zero. How was the trick turned? The fact that arbitrary conclusions were not drawn, this is responding to the objections of classical logic, even though the reasoning was carried out on the basis of inconsistencies, means that there was something tricky in the procedure. So the inference procedure involved must have been paraconsistent. Now you might say, well, wait a second, this is absolutely not historically accurate. Paraconsistent logic didn't exist when Newton was alive. This requires a lot of theoretical commitments to paraconsistent logic. So we know this not to be the actual reconstruction of what happened at the moment. But can it provide us any type of understanding? And if so, what type of understanding? So what I want to say is that depending on each of the cases that we have in mind and the level or the degree of the distortions that are involved in the building of philosophically biased reconstructions, the understanding that we can obtain can be of our philosophical theses about science or even about the scientific episode in itself. So this will depend on the quality of information, on the way in which we are filtering or distorting the historical evidence, and how well we are building actually the reconstructions. It might be the case that I want to fit a historical reconstruction with a philosophical thesis, but I am very bad at doing so, and I won't be able to do it. So the intention of trying to fit historical evidence in order to show or corroborate or strengthen the evidence in favor of a given philosophical thesis is not enough. We have to do it well. So, but say that I'm very efficient at doing this, and then the question is, can I get scientific understanding as philosophers know it? So philosophers tend to call scientific understanding as an epistemic achievement that consists in successfully identifying relations of dependence. Understanding something is often thought to manifest differentially. If I understand P, that means that I am able to draw a broad range of correct inference about P, such that P makes sense. Understanding is about determining privileged arrangements in such a way that they provide the most cohesive and comprehensive representation of a given domain. What this domain would be in these cases would depend on either whether we want to understand better the philosophical theory, the philosophical thesis, or the actual historical episode. In cases of genuine scientific understanding, agents identify either patterns of dependence, explanatory connections, causal structures, or inferential pathways among a set of facts, models, theories, and representations, among others. Okay, that can be understanding. But is there any particular type of understanding that we're going to gain? Because it seems fishy to say that I'm going to get something really good out of something very bad as a bias, philosophically biased historical reconstruction. So, especially considering that. Now, what I think is going to happen here is that I'm going to get a very weak, but still extremely valuable type of understanding, a structural understanding. So the crucial element in understanding for this type of understanding is that we are positing some sort of a structure, functions and relations that are holding us for some objects as a means of making sense of the actual causal, logical, mathematical, constructive, and other dependence relations holding between an unobservable and observable parts of the domain. So this is, I am not understanding the actual world, knowing that is the actual world, but I am understanding patterns that hold within a domain that I am representing. In this view, in any view that is structuralist about understanding, the hypothetical positing of such structures, as opposed to the categorical assertion that they hold, is what allows agents and epistemic communities to build inferential networks for that domain under study. The way in which I manifest that I have a structural understanding is that in the end, I can navigate very efficiently the logical space that is constraining that phenomenon that I think I understand. So especially this comes handy if I know that I don't know whether philosophical thesis can be true, as I know that the claim of it being rainy outside or it being sunny outside might be true or false, but I can determine that truth value. So in the case of philosophical thesis, that seems maybe further away from what we are able to do right now. And especially if I am trying to use a faulty vehicle to achieve that understanding, I wonder whether I can commit to say anything true about the world, the history, or even the philosophical thesis. And so something good about the structural takes on understanding is that what is understood here in these cases of defective scenarios where theories model phenomena are either vague, imprecise, false, inconsistent, and so on and so forth, is that some structures can be posited of some objects in the domain of the purposes of saying explanatory things about them, given the posited structure. This is, if I gain understanding of a philosophical thesis, then I'm going to be able to explain how this thesis should behave in a particular environment that it will belong to, and how a particular case will illustrate the relations that this thesis holds or allows to hold. So even if people like Peter Vickers and Kevin Davey were correct, and this reconstruction of Newtonian early calculus is not faulty, is extremely faulty methodologically speaking, it is still sensible to conclude that the reconstruction was tailored to illustrate the way in which chunk and permeate works. In that sense, if we look at the impact that this reconstruction has had in the literature of paraconsistent logic, after chunk and permeate interpretation, we can say it does it satisfactorily. We have many papers discussing whether this case study and this chunk and permeate reconstruction are fine-tuned enough, whether you can make some changes, whether you need to add more layers. And it seems that it has provided the community with an understanding of what chunk and permeate is, how it relates to the case study, and how inconsistency-tolerant reasoning in scientific contexts might look like. So we have three different topics that we understood better thanks to this reconstruction at three different philosophical levels. Thus, the reconstruction should be taken as methodologically useful and epistemically valuable because it helps to clarify how paraconsistent reasoning scenarios should look given a specific framework, but it also tells us a lot about that specific framework and the relations that hold within it. So that said, what I wanted to say today is that there are certain philosophically biased historical reconstructions that intuitively can contribute to a deeper understanding of philosophical theses about sciences by clarifying key concepts, illustrating their applications, or shedding light to the historical episodes that they engage with. They achieve this by effectively exemplifying salient features of philosophical theses, as well as by providing context and identifying potential challenges for their evaluation. The type of such understanding, of the understanding that these reconstructions can provide is not factive. So in the case of philosophical theses, we might not know whether they are true or not. But of course, in the case of the historical episode, as we are taking evidence away, we might also not know, or actually know, that they are not true. But still can be significantly because it aligns with the structuralist take on scientific understanding, reinforcing the idea that we gained some epistemic products after using these philosophically biased reconstructions in our philosophical practice. And thank you very much. There is this claim by Vickers also accusing other parts of the community for just producing historical evidence in order to publish. And that's it. Thank you.
I cannot put it. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Maria. That was a wonderful talk. Very impressive. Okay, so now we can open the discussion. Ambrosio?
Thank you very much, Tere, and thank you very much, Maria. It has been a wonderful. Sorry, I am going to take this out. It has been a wonderful workshop. I haven't been able to be in all the sessions because I have to teach, but great. I like very much, and I agree very much, Maria, with your thesis. But let me provoke you a little bit. Uh, what I'm going to say, I really believe what I'm going to say. So, do you think that a philosophical historical reconstruction of science or of theory of political thought, whatever, necessarily must be historically anachronistic? I believe that yes, but I don't know what you think.
I don't think it has to be that way. I think all these additional biases that we are going to get are going to depend mostly on the type of philosophical aims that we want to satisfy in those particular cases. So in some cases, it might be necessary for it to be anachronistic, but in some others, if you are doing philosophy of history or you are actually committed to um, historiographical disciplines, then you don't want to have anachronism as part of the biases that you are adding to when reconstructing, right? So I think it depends on the particular philosophical aims that we are willing to sacrifice and those that we are actually pursuing in when reconstructing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambrose.
Thank you. Kirsten?
Yeah, thanks for your talk. That was really interesting. It did kind of come up against some things that I've worried about on occasion, and yeah, and so I guess my main question for you is, well, what work is being done by these case studies or these rational reconstructions being presented as true? Because it strikes me that if philosophers want to be using toy examples to illustrate and aid with understanding and to kind of explore possibility space and all the things that you really nicely described that philosophers want to do with these things, couldn't they just change the names and present these things as made up examples or like counterfactual histories? This might have been otherwise, but just so you don't get confused, let's change the names of the players, and so that we're not confusing this with history, because we don't want to make the mistake of actually thinking this is how the history played itself out. Is it that true stories are just like more compelling and we kind of care about them more, or is there something else going on? Yeah, because it strikes me that if these things are presented as true things, and I really like the example you used, because as somebody who did their grads work in Australia and New Zealand, I met a lot of Graham Priest's students who always asked me about the inconsistency stuff in Newton's calculus. And so it's clearly something that's really kind of deeply entrenched. And I think that's because they think it's true, and because it's a famous figure. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think you are touching on a very problematic part of this of the practice of using philosophically biased historical reconstructions, because of course there is the epistemology of that, saying that as I would say, you can still get some benefits like having understanding, maybe you can get some explanations, so on and so forth. So it depends on the cases, it depends on the explanation of philosophical thesis that you have, but still you can get something good epistemically. But on the other hand, there is a lot of, and I think this is Beaker's concern, there's a lot of propaganda by created by saying this is true. And as you are saying about the Australian, but I think it's general logicians all over the world that are very committed to the idea that the Newtonian early calculus was one of the most salient examples of inconsistent successful theories. What that tells you is this is really bad, right? that is the reason why people are resistant to have philosophically biased historical reconstructions. And so, of course, my concern is always how can we mediate this? Because we have to have a normative claim about don't do this, guys. But we also have to explain why, despite they are doing it in such a faulty way, we are still gaining something. And I think this is a question that we philosophers almost never ask. Why something still works, even though we know it's part of propaganda, it's probably a lie, it's probably like not something that a philosopher that takes seriously the profession should be doing, and so on, and still it doesn't work. So I totally agree with you. I think there are many cases, poor historians and philosophers of science that have worked on those cases, because they will get these questions. The Bohr's model of the atom is another one that it doesn't really matter who worked on that, will be asked, was it inconsistent, as Graham Priest has said? And so, yes, I only have to say that the problem is that we have to explain why it succeeds, even though it's surrounded by these epistemic negative environments, or it's actually creating these epistemic negative environments, but still getting something good, epistemically speaking. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Andres?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I am concerned about the conditions for a historical reconstruction to be uh, epistemically useful. Because, well, you have accepted that these reconstructions can be biased, but intuitively, not any historical case can support, not support, but illustrate any philosophical thesis. Uh, I was also concerned about historical reconstruction to be epistemically powerful to refute a philosophical thesis. Would it be possible in your view? I mean, for example, in this case, if anyone said, well, that reconstruction is not adequate to illustrate this because mm, something, some historical data prevented, could it be the case?
So I take your second question to be something about whether there is a necessary convergence between the epistemic goods that we can have when using historical reconstructions in philosophy without saying biased. So whether we have one very good historical reconstruction, it should be able to help us testing philosophical theories, but it also should be able to give us explanation and should be able to promote understanding. And so the better our reconstructions are, the more convergence we are going to see in epistemic goods. And I think I don't see how that happens, because in my experience, while looking at these case studies, mostly those related to contradictions being tolerated in science, what I see is that they do some epistemic good, but they are actually of no use for testing any philosophical theory, even those that might be more compelling, like Matthias Frisch's reconstruction of classical electrodynamics. That is very compelling, but I don't think it reinforces any philosophical thesis in the sense of proving a test. So I don't see that convergence to be necessary. It might be that some cases in which you are very successful at reconstructing like truthfully, and that you have a lot of philosophical clarity and your philosophical thesis is actually correct. In those cases, you might see convergence, but that should be only because you are doing an extremely good job in every single task. And that relates to your first question, which is, which are the criteria that you have to have for having good philosophically biased historical reconstructions? And maybe this connects with Kristen's concern about why don't we call it just toy examples. And the idea is that we actually want to talk about science. We are philosophers of science. We don't want to say, I imagine these possible scenarios. So I want to engage with historical evidence or with actual scientific practice as much as possible. And so it is always better to to convey true statements and true reconstructions of how it happened. And so that makes it better. And the aim that we have to reconstruct truthfully whatever happened in the past or whatever is happening right now in scientific practice should not be overlooked as part of the design of building historical reconstruction, either philosophically biased or ideally not so philosophically biased. And so what will make the difference is not only using as much or as many truth data points that we can, or as many reliable sources as we can, but also having clarity about our philosophical thesis that we want to explore and to illustrate. The thing with, for instance, with the case of inconsistency toleration in science is that at the beginning the thesis was very general, and then the examples helped to refine it at the beginning. So we got a lot of discussion with the one of the examples of Graham Priest in order to find human reasoning, if inconsistency tolerant, cannot be like this. Thanks to those examples, to saying this doesn't look natural, this doesn't look well, this looks like a very poor toy example. And then the examples got refined and more refined. And some of them might be connected to what actually happened in the historical period, maybe not exactly how it happened, but it relates more or less to the episode that it's being reconstructed. And that leads to having understanding of something else, not only of philosophy or philosophical thesis, but also of science. So there might be cases in which our philosophical thesis is very good and it's going to be correct about that domain. And so when we fit the evidence, when we cut the evidence to fit the thesis, then we are actually having the best reconstruction to understand that particular historical episode and also to understand our philosophical thesis. But those are like highly good scenarios. So that to say that they shouldn't be just toy examples. You have to have standards about how to gather evidence, how to gather true information, as many sources as possible, and how to make reliable connections, even if you are knowingly philosophically biased. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you. And one last question, Dubian?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for your talk. Quite informative. I'm just confused about your point concerning the non-factive character of philosophically biased reconstructions. Let me first know whether I got your point. You said that philosophically biased case studies are not non-factive because they want to make a philosophical thesis, and philosophical points are non-factive, right?
I say that we don't know whether they are true or not in the large majority of cases. We have expectations, but we don't know whether they can be true or not.
But they can be factive. I mean,
they can be,
when
yes.
when I formulate a philosophical claim, I am assuming a sort of semantic realism about that claim. I'm taking the claim at face value.
I think it depends on different stages of when you are formulating a claim. But most of the time, our philosophical claims are not isolated, right? They are very much conditioned by a philosophical framework and a very specific traditional background and so on. And that makes the list of conditions for the truth value of those claims very extensive. So if you have to test every single of those conditionals in order to know whether your claim is true or false, that makes it less straightforward. And that's the reason why it's better to just say some of them might be true, and maybe we are going to find out which ones are. But if they are not, and if they have no truth value assigned yet, that's fine. We can still have understanding without having that requirement satisfied.
Okay, so my question is, what is the scope of your claim that the understanding philosophically biased case studies are providing is non-factual or non-factive?
that it doesn't require you to have a grasp of the truth of everything that you are understanding. So in the literature of understanding, if you are a factivist, that means that you are committed to the idea that you can only understand true things. So I can understand a phenomenon through a theory if the phenomenon actually exists and the claims about that phenomenon are satisfied. And so in these cases, you can still say, well, I don't know whether that phenomenon, the mind, the soul, and all these philosophical scientific theories in general actually exist as I am claiming them to be. But I can understand how the world would look like if they exist, and under which conditions we would be able to make some inferences, and which inferences would be forbidden in this context, and so on. That is the main idea about having understanding something non-factually.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you very much.